Order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Select Committee on the Department for Business and Trade, and we are holding an evidence session this morning as part of our inquiry on industrial policy, and specifically we're looking at the opportunities for the UK around industrial policy and the transition to net zero. So Cameron, maybe I could start with you. Could you just tell us, is the transition to net zero good for jobs in Britain?
I think that's a fairly low-ball, easy question. Thank you very much, Chairman. It's nice to be here. It's very clear that there's a net increase in jobs. So unless you've got an overheated economy with too much employment and you're worried about inflation, this transition is going to create jobs. Now, there's a lot of nuance in that answer. So I think we will have a paper coming out within the next week that looks at, actually calculates jobs created, 250,000 in total, 150,000 direct, 100,000 indirect. There's a wider range of estimates from the Committee on Climate Change, which I think varies from 135 to just over 700,000 jobs. So the ranges are wide. What's clear, and has been clear now for a decade, is that there's net job creation. That's partly because as you move from an economy that requires more material inputs to one in which you're using the sun and the wind and you're more efficient about how you do things, there's more need and scope for the labour side. And in particular, the transition itself involves a scale-up. We might call them capital expenditure-related jobs, to build it out. We have another unpublished study looking at US power system jobs where you get this burst of 600,000 jobs to transition the US power system to net zero by 2035, falling back down to 200,000 of steady state jobs. So there's good and bad here. The good is that if you want jobs, you're going to get them. The bad is that several decades in, some of those jobs are going to fade away as the build slows down and people return to having to do other things.
Tell me a bit more about these jobs. How well paid are they going to be? Where are they going to be?
Right, great questions. Yep, super. So the evidence is mixed on how well they're going to be paid. There's some suggestion that on average they'll be less well paid than equivalent jobs in the oil and gas sector. They're less risky on average, so there's less of a premium. But there's equally some evidence that suggests these are higher tech jobs. So I'm not sure I can give you a clear answer on average wages.
And that's because we don't know?
It's because I don't know at this point.
Does anybody know?
Not as far as I'm aware. But I think these. I mean, we're projecting, so we can and do studies to try and pin these sort of numbers down, or at least wage differentials down. But I'm not going to sit here with confidence and say there will be 10% average increase in wages or whatever.
Yeah. In the debate on artificial intelligence, there's now a lot of argumentation and a lot of analysis about how this is basically going to bifurcate the jobs market, and that many jobs will be automated and therefore low-skilled jobs will potentially suffer lower wages, whereas the returns to capital and the returns to higher-skilled jobs will probably rise, and therefore there could be this new inequality in the jobs market. Are you anxious about any kinds of trends like that?
Yes, and it was research at Oxford that kicked off the global anxiety about this issue, saying 47% of jobs will be destroyed by AI. I think while you present certainly a more nuanced picture than all the jobs are going to go there, it's perhaps even more nuanced than that. There are certainly some. I think the key question is the automatability of jobs. So there are some currently high-skilled jobs that a computer can do, or not a computer, a generalized or an artificial intelligent machine can do just as well. For instance, I've seen in my own, this is anecdotal evidence, but in my own personal life, corporate life, coders are quite easy to replace, it turns out. And GPT 3 and 4 actually enable, if you need to fire people, it's the coders that you can get rid of. No, these are previously thought of as very high-skilled jobs.
But in the transition to net zero, are you basically saying that there will be winners and losers?
There will be winners and losers. That's absolutely clear.
And will the winners outweigh the losers?
Yes, we expect so. With
more winners
fairly
than
high
losers.
Confidence. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. And then which are the sectors, which are the parts of the economy that will be most jobs rich as a result of the transition to a lower carbon economy?
Yeah. So, I mean, the big changes come this is not very granular, but energy sector, industry, buildings and transport. They're the four big ones that will be changed by the net zero transition. Of course, in a sense, the whole economy is affected, but they're the four major sectors. We see, I think, job creation net in all of those sectors globally. Now, of course, as you say, winners and losers. How well does the UK car industry fare? It's doing its best. Were things different in 2010 when the Chinese were aggressively seeking advice about how to build out an EV industry? I was rebuffed by car industries in Europe and here where there was limited interest, saying that this is going to happen much further down the line. Now, we're here now. So one of the features about, and perhaps we'll come on to this later, but one of the features about industrial competitiveness is that it's path dependent and there's clustering effects, and there are opportunities that come, and if you miss them, they're gone. I'm not saying the UK car industry has missed the opportunity, but it's now racing, I guess, to catch up.
So there'll be some sectors which are going to create a lot of jobs, and it sounds like that they're non-internationally traded sectors by and large. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean most of those are not internationally traded.
Yeah, okay.
There'll
There'll be some sectors that become almost sunset industries, perhaps, and then it sounds like that there will be some sectors which are potentially in peril, but could grow.
That's right, and I mean if
and you'd put automotive in that bracket, would you?
Certainly in peril, and certainly the space is transitioning very quickly, and the UK's had a historic set of comparative advantages there, and as we know from Penny Mealy and Alexander Titelbaum's work, countries tend to be able to move to adjacent spaces from a space where they have an advantage. So can we build on that advantage? It's a reasonable case. The case against is that actually an EV is a very different vehicle from an internal combustion engine. You need comparative advantage in battery packs and the kit around that, and in software, whereas in an internal combustion engine vehicle, it's about the ball bearings and the gearing and the combustion chambers and so on. So it's a different bit of kit, perhaps.
So do we need an industrial strategy to help us capitalise on potential transition to net zero?
Yes. To put this one way, which I think will be enlightening, if you go back 60 or 70 years and look at, say, South Korea and say, let's leave it to the market for them to specialise in their area of comparative advantage, well, they would be a world-leading exporter of rice right now, not of the Samsung phones that are in your pockets and the cars that we drive around. And I think it is welcome that we've had a return to thinking more strategically about the country and about industrial policy. It's necessary for net zero, but I would argue that the state is always... You don't want the state to be intervening very directly and picking winning firms. I mean, that's a recipe for picking losers, but you do need an overarching strategic direction where those in charge are thinking about how to direct resources to build and enhance and move from one area of comparative advantage to another. And that's what the East Asians have done so well, and I dare say we haven't done so well in recent decades.
Hannah, can I ask you, you might just say a word about the investors group that you help steward, but can you tell us, do you think investors in this country want to invest in the transition to net zero?
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the ABI, which represents more than 300 firms across the UK's insurance and long-term savings industry. And you mentioned our investment delivery forum, and that's a new initiative that we mobilised last summer in order to capitalise on the regulatory reforms that are being introduced through Solvency UK. And essentially what Solvency UK will do is enable insurers to invest in a broader range of productive assets than was previously the case. And we believe that this has the potential to unlock 100 billion of investment over the next decade in green and good projects.
In Britain?
in Britain, exactly. We want to make...
Sorry, just this is from what you think the group you represent has got available 100 billion to invest in Britain.
We have pledged 100 billion and we want to make that investment in green and good infrastructure across the UK. And to act as a catalyst, the forum was mobilised with 7 of the largest of our ABI members. They are Aviva, Rothsay, M&G, Phoenix Group, Lloyds Banking Group, Royal London and Just Group. All of those businesses want to invest in the UK. The forum has identified a number of barriers. These are not new barriers, unfortunately, they're long-standing barriers, but we want to work together with all stakeholders, government, bodies such as 3CI, the Green Finance Institute and beyond, to see can we find mechanisms through which we can actually unlock this investment potential. So to give you a sense of some of the recommendations that we've put forward, and I'd be very happy to submit to the committee our paper that we published earlier this year with a suite of policy recommendations. We think the first thing is Solvency UK has to be implemented. That looks to be on track for the end of this year. We also need to see faster decisions coming from government and that those decisions are committed to for the long term. That's a message that was in the National Infrastructure Commission's paper that came out last week, and it certainly resonated with my experience through the forum. What kind of decisions? I mean, government makes zillions of decisions every day. What are the decisions you're worried about? Well, we've seen sometimes reversals of policy decisions or last-minute changes to policies, such as the heat policy, which then led to less incentive to invest in heat pumps, for example. We would like there to be a long-term approach. That's the critical ask from our industry. If you think about the nature of insurers and long-term investors' businesses, we are investing for many decades. These are people's pensions that we're talking about. And the regulatory framework means that we need to see a steady, predictable rate of return across a long time period. And what the forum has identified is there's a problem around the supply of investable projects. We are working quite intensively with a lot of stakeholders to identify where might there be opportunities to invest across 3 areas: energy generation, energy networks and transport. But alongside that, we also need to see a long-term approach coming from government. It's done some good work. We think the Powering Up Britain and the Net Zero strategy are great foundations, but really what we'd like to see is a national transition plan supported by sector-specific strategies that set out a clear roadmap with milestones so that investors know what investment is needed when.
Okay, so whose money is it these people are investing?
The companies I've mentioned are serving customers right across the country. They are UK policyholders and savers.
So this is British savers, basically. So they're stewarding money from British long-term savers.
That's correct.
Okay, and they are confident that they want to invest this money in the transition to net zero?
We have committed as an industry. In 2021, the ABI published our climate change roadmap, which sets out a series of actions for the industry to get to net zero.
Yeah.
But you're raising an interesting question, Chair, and I wonder where you're trying to take this. Is to do with the fundamental objective of these businesses is to deliver a good rate of return for the savers. That is the primary obligation.
Because they're not investing right now, presumably that rate of return isn't currently available today.
They are already investing. What the changes to the regulatory framework will allow is them to invest in a broader range of productive assets. We are exploring opportunities for different types of co-investment model. So that would enable us to find a way of smoothing the risk at the start of a project so that insurers might be able to contribute upfront.
I've just got one more before I hand over to Jane Hunt. So you said there were 3 sectors there that were being prioritised: energy, energy networks and transport. That is a different list to Cameron's list of where the big job numbers are going to be. And in particular, what's missing is buildings.
Well, we're looking at housing as well, but I would say that is quite a broad sector. We have identified some challenges in terms of the retrofitting model, but we are partnering with a number of organisations such as 3CI to see can we come up with investment models that would enable retrofitting at scale. There is a project underway at the moment. Lloyds Banking Group is involved with 3CI, West Yorkshire Combined Authority, Octopus Energy, to see can they come up with an investment model that would enable them to invest in retrofitting at scale. And we are looking at buildings in the round. You were asking earlier about jobs. I think from our perspective, we see that there's a big opportunity for job creation through the transition to net zero, but what is needed is consideration of the skills that are required in order to get us there. One of our suggestions has been looking at the construction industry training board levy to make sure that the scope of that levy covers the occupations that are going to be needed in the future to build the sustainable and energy efficient homes that we all want. And the apprenticeship levy transfer is another area that might be leveraged to help with that.
Thank you very much, Chair. So this has been classed as the net zero, that is, as the economic opportunity of the 21st century. And I'm just wondering if that's true. So I'm going to try and challenge you on it, if that's okay. So the £100 billion investment sounds very exciting as a long-term approach. However, I'm concerned that because we're going for 2050, but other countries are going for a later date, that actually, in terms of productivity, we might actually lose some of that production within the UK because instead of doing that investment, taking that investment up in the UK, they will simply transfer those jobs and that production to another country that doesn't need to hit net zero until, say, 20 years onwards. What do you think about that, Hannah?
Well, I think competition for investment is certainly intensifying globally. We've seen measures such as the US Inflation Reduction Act and the EU Green Deal, and capital's mobile. It will go where it can find the best balance of risk and return. What I can say on behalf of the members that I represent is that we are committed through the Investment Delivery Forum to try and find those opportunities for investment in the UK in green and good projects, and also working collaboratively with government at all levels of government and other stakeholders to see can we find ways to accelerate the infrastructure development that we need.
And given we've got low productivity, generally speaking, in the UK in comparison to other countries, do you think this is really an opportunity for us then?
I do believe it's an opportunity. It's a huge shift for us all as a society and an economy, but it's absolutely critical if we are going to achieve the net zero targets that the government has committed to. As an industry, we really want to play our part. We think we play a key enabling role, and I would say on behalf of the insurance sector, we have an important role both as an investor but also as a risk enabler. So on the insurance side, we can also help to insure projects so that they can have more confidence in delivery and execution, which in turn can increase investor appetite for those projects.
Thank you. So Cameron, do you think the balance is about right for the UK because it gives us an opportunity to do something about productivity that we've not been able to do for a long, long time? And do you think that will actually happen, or will there simply be almost a lazy shift to other countries?
Well, I certainly don't think we should be going any slower. And if anything, the concern I would have, rather than because other countries are moving, have 2060 targets like perhaps China, that they're attracting the investment. I think, in a sense, the concern really is the opposite. Hannah mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. In the year after that it was passed, we've seen $224 billion already flow in from private capital into investment because investors are seeing that this is a huge opportunity for future returns. And I would add, actually, the key thing is the risk-adjusted return. So you don't mind making a modest return if you know that the policy framework is clear and your risks are minimized. And I think, in a sense, that the challenge that we've had in this country, perhaps in recent years, is that the risk associated with the returns that one might hope to achieve is a little too high. So I'd focus on reducing the risk as much as raising the returns. I think in terms of the opportunity to correct our lagging productivity, since the global financial crisis, we've been total factor productivity has been increasing at about 0.7% per annum. Before that was 2.1%. If we'd increased at the rates that we had historically been increasing our productivity by, every person in every person in the UK would be more than £10,000 better off. So this is a big deal. Can net zero help? Yes. Can it do all the burden of raising UK productivity? No. The fundamental challenge is that we undersave in this country Our net national savings rate at the bottom of the OECD, or near the bottom of the OECD tables, in between Greece and Portugal, if I remember correctly, and a very long way off the Norwegians and the Swiss and the Taiwanese and the South Koreans. And our investment levels lag. I mean, we're a full, I think, 4% of GDP below G7 levels in investment. Until recently, that was a mix of both public and private investment. Very recently, the public investment has risen, so it's now, as much as anything, a private investment story. So getting the suite of policies that can direct Hannah's group and others to think, I have a look at the UK, I can see a good risk-adjusted return here, I'm going to pile in. That is now, I think, top priority of business.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Douglas Chapman.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm actually quite interested in how this might affect regional policy across the UK. And I just wonder, from your perspective, what are the big opportunities to improve productivity? For example, outside the Golden Triangle and in the southeast of England, for example, how do we actually try and, I know the government are trying to level up, but this seems like an ideal opportunity to level up some of the communities and countries that have been left behind in the growth in economic activity in the UK. So what's your view on how we might be able to do that?
So my view is that it is indeed an opportunity. We're not going to be building vast arrays of offshore wind farms in London, nor are we going to be building hydrogen storage units at scale in the M25, nor carbon capture there. But that is where a lot of the capital and the jobs has to flow. Not that location, but in those sectors, in those activities. They are naturally, sensibly going to be in places that will contribute to levelling up. And if I might just take perhaps a step back and say, one of the main drivers of productivity gains, this is work we have underway at Oxford, not yet published, is how efficiently we're able to reduce costs, to reduce our energy costs, which we expect to happen as you move towards a cheaper, cleaner energy system, but also how efficiently we use that energy. At the moment, we pay foreign countries vast amounts of money. In 2022, it was over £100 billion to import their fossil fuels and then pump them into our houses that are inefficiently insulated, and the money just simply goes out the roof, out the windows, and we wonder why we're not a productive economy. Getting those costs down economy-wide will increase the competitiveness of existing industries in the north of England and outside the Golden Triangle, which has smaller but economy-wide effects on the UK's competitiveness at the global scale. So I'd say there are those two sectors. One is a concentrated focus on building out the industries that we need in places that aren't London, and the other is a broader economy-wide productivity effect.
Do you feel that the current government's policy and strategy is sufficient to actually support that as well, in terms of resilience, in terms of infrastructure, or is that coming, or is it coming too slow? And do we have the sufficient skills at the moment to actually take advantage of some of these opportunities?
We've had a mixed record, I think, on this space, and if I'm being completely honest, I think we're not on track either to meet the targets that we have, and nor is the current levels of investment or work in skills what ideally it would be, given the transformation of the economy that we're moving towards now. But that doesn't mean we can't fix these problems.
Hannah, what's your view on the regional levelling up thing for a start?
Certainly we see this as an opportunity for a just transition, and we want to find a way that all communities can benefit. One practical challenge that we've identified is the level of skills and capability. It's not consistent across different regions, and we are therefore calling for bodies such as the Royal Town Planning Institute to help train more planning officers, so that you've got a more skilled workforce that can get the planning applications approved more quickly. There's also a challenge around the ability to prepare investment cases that meet the needs of institutional investors. Again, there's inconsistency across different regions. We would like to find a way to help tackle that because the alternative is that you will end up in a situation where certain regions, Manchester would be an obvious one, they've simply got a lot more muscle memory in terms of developing those investment cases and can present a more credible case more quickly to institutional investors.
Okay. I'm just thinking in terms of Scotland as well, because it's obviously we've got quite a lot of offshore wind, for example, that we can utilise from there. I just wonder what the, how you would view that in terms of, being a major powerhouse for the UK and how we could take advantage of that particular situation and whether there's sufficient investment going in now to actually provide not just the jobs but that level of activity. I'm not really seeing on the ground any turbines and things being built in Scotland. I just wondered if, in terms of, we're just back from the States as well, we've been looking at their industrial policy and all sorts of things and how there's protections within agreements. I just wondered if that's something that you would agree with as well in terms of should there be a certain percentage of build that is within contracts and so on to make sure that the jobs and the activity does come to the North East, comes to Scotland, comes to Wales, for example, other parts of the UK that would actually benefit from this opportunity.
Well, in terms of your question around whether there should be anything contractually around the regions or geographies where certain materials should be manufactured, I'll leave that to Professor Hepburn, I think, if that's okay. But just in terms of the opportunity for Scotland, there's a huge opportunity for Scotland. If you look at PwC's Green Barometer, it says that across the UK they estimate for every one green job, 1.4 green jobs will be created. But if you look in Scotland, that multiplies up to about six jobs or thereabouts. And of course the UK has really led the way in offshore fixed wind, and that creates a big opportunity for us to lead the way on offshore floating wind. One of the things that we're doing through the forum is working with the Scottish National Investment Bank to see if we can develop models to enable insurers to put forward some of that upfront initial investment that's needed in the port infrastructure that's absolutely critical to enabling the deployment of offshore floating wind. And I should say that the chair of the SNIB, Willie Watt, he is a member of our advisory panel that we convene to help inform the work of the forum. So there's a big opportunity for Scotland on offshore floating wind and fixed.
And just finally, Professor.
Yeah, so I'm going to come at your question slightly obliquely and say slightly nerdily and say that if we had a power system that priced power more regionally, as say the Texans do, then what you would find is that electricity would be a lot cheaper in Scotland because there is excess supply, there's cheap wind, and more to come. And if you found that electricity were cheaper in Scotland, it would make sense to then relocate other downstream energy-intensive industries to where the energy is cheap. Now, I think that is a change that we might see coming, one can hope, from the way in which the grid is being reorganised to deal with a net zero future. It makes sense for all sorts of economic reasons to price things sensibly where they should be, and it would advantage Scotland. In terms of local content requirements and contractual, obviously this is the sort of thing that, in principle, it would be better if the world as a whole didn't do these sorts of things. But the world does do these sorts of things, and we see it in all sorts of countries for good, understandable strategic reasons. So I don't think ideology should necessarily get in the way of thinking strategically about which industries you want to sensibly ensure are at least partially located locally in Scotland, near to where the action is happening.
That could be part of an industrial policy for the whole of the UK.
Potentially, yeah.
Can I just check, Cameron, from your point of view, do you know where the jobs could be created? Have you got a kind of a geographical view of where those jobs might lie?
I'm afraid to say that we've got very good spatial forecasts of jobs and where they're being created in the US right now. That's the data set that we've been working on. It's quite interesting. We, as far as I'm aware, well, at least the team that I see who has this work in progress doesn't have that in the UK.
Okay, so that's a gap. I'm just because
it's a gap. It should be doable, though.
If Hannah says there's a capability gap in different parts of the country, it would be useful to know whether the capability gap is actually in the same place as the job growth potential.
Yep.
But we can come back to that. Andy MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Fascinating evidence thus far. Thank you. I just want to look at just this immensely competitive environment there is now for net zero technologies, and I think you've already touched upon that to a large degree. I think did you say it was 224 billion has been levered in?
Yes.
But so far, it's colossal. I mean, how else has that changed? Is there any other evidence that we should be aware of in terms of the environment's been changed by the IRA and by the European Green Deal?
Well, I prefer that kind of macro evidence. I've got plenty of anecdotal evidence, stories of particular firms who are about to locate here or in Europe who have moved over to the US to take advantage of the various tax credits and incentives in the US space. But as economists, anecdata don't make as we call them, a compelling story. But there's plenty of stories.
And Hannah, it's incredible that you've got this amount of money ready to invest, and of course those of us who've got an eye on trying to address some of the disadvantaged communities that we're talking about. I mean, we've just been to a session this morning, the Diabetes UK. The rate of adolescent diabetes is on the rise, and the result is 13 years reduction in life expectancy. These are the sort of things we see. So I'm just thinking in terms of your pot. You know, have you got that ESG approach to how that's going to? Does that enter into your thinking at all in terms of how you deploy your resources?
I have to be clear, it's not my pot.
Well, I'm being. You wish.
But across the industry, I mean, as a whole, the industry is firmly behind the transition to net zero, and they see that in the broadest sense. We want to do good. If I think about the purpose of the ABI that we introduced when I joined last year, it is together driving change to protect and build a thriving society. My members are behind that. That's what we want to do. I'd be very happy to have a conversation with you to learn more about the meeting that you had earlier today. I think you raise a really interesting point, though. From my perspective, one of the drivers behind mobilising the forum was there had been political and regulatory reform, and as an industry, we wanted to deliver our part against that. But we have faced a challenge which Lord Harrington has identified in his review, which is there is no one-stop shop for us to be able to go to. So we have been engaging with many departments across Whitehall. We've been engaging at the regional level to try and identify where are the projects, where is the pipeline of investable projects that we want to be able to invest in. And it does seem to me that there is a need for a long-term strategic plan to ensure that as a whole, the UK can benefit from the investment potential that's there.
I just want your question triggered a couple of further thoughts, if I may. Firstly, there's an excellent LSE paper led by Dimitri Zangelis that you should be aware on productivity issues. Secondly, in terms of diabetes, because the health and productivity nexus is very close. Yesterday I was in Cyprus telling them, or talking with them about how they can change their economy. Air pollution and particulate matter is the fourth biggest killer of people in Cyprus because they're running their economy on oil. They're still burning oil. Now, it's not as bad here in the UK. We've made big strides on improving health outcomes related to respiratory disease and pollution, but it's still a big issue in terms of both death and productivity loss. And I think one thing to really not lose sight of is that even if these things are sometimes more difficult to quantify economically, we know there's a raft of these other benefits that will flow from the net zero transition. You know, we've got a team looking at productivity gains. They look significant but modest at the economy-wide level. But these kind of health-related effects, they're not necessarily in there because, not yet at least, because they're hard to quantify, but I think they're quite important.
whilst I've got you, just on the structure of these, the IRA and the EU Green Industrial Plan, we can't do things on that scale. It's just not possible. But are there any lessons that the UK could lift from these programmes, from the design and the implementation? Is there anything to pinch?
Yeah, so just on the scale, yes, we can't do, the estimated number was 370 billion, but it's effectively uncapped. But, there's about that many Americans, roughly speaking, so at the million level, so it's 1,000 per person. And you can then do the numbers here. That would be a 60 billion, adjusting for currencies, say 50 billion pound program here if you scaled it down.
Yes.
So it gives you a sense of, and this is not wildly off, the Committee on Climate Change's number is about 40 billion per annum. We scale up to that by 2030. The LSE Grantham's paper suggests about 1% of GDP, so 25, 26 billion, levering in another 2%. So the scale, you can adjust that down and work out what we roughly need to do. As I say, Oxford will have a paper coming out in the next week or so that is in the same order of magnitude. It's low tens of billions. And then the second part of your question is, so what do we learn about the design mechanism as well as the scale? And I think it's very hard to get these kind of large-scale incentives completely perfect. You're not going to. There'll be waste, there'll be some degree of dodginess around the edges and some things that you incentivize that probably would have happened anyway. So, I'm not sitting here and saying the IRA is a perfect instrument, but it has been designed in a way that, there's lots of different components of it, but many of them effectively match the private with the public. So you're in partnerships, so the risks look lower, so the government effectively has a stake in what's going on because you've got a tax credit or some sort of production credit. And I think the Americans aren't stupid when it comes to doing this sort of thing. I think we were mightily impressed at the attention they'd given to working out how these programs would impact. You talked about bonus credits that meet certain conditions, such as locating in low-income communities or meeting domestic content requirement. That seems to be well worked through, and I'm just wondering if you think there's scope, and is it appropriate for us to adopt the same sort of granular approach, because this was quite focused on how it was going to impact. Is there scope, and should we do it? Yes and yes. Now, of course, it'll look different for the UK context, and
we've had a number of programs that have just run into the sand. We haven't had the. I'm thinking about insulating homes and things of that nature. It hasn't happened to any great effect, and I think everybody would accept that it hasn't happened.
No, that's right.
If we could just pick up their algorithms and
it's crazy that hasn't happened. I mean, you talk about wasting vast amounts of money every year. That's a perfectly good example.
Okay. Thanks.
Ian Labour.
Thanks, Chair. We've discussed very briefly, we've touched on the US Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and of course the EU's Green Deal Industrial Plan. We've touched on that this morning. But could you say what effect that these plans have on the UK's competitiveness in net zero industries?
Yeah, so the relative competitiveness, obviously, of the UK looks poorer once you have this sort of heavy, large-scale intervention across other jurisdictions, whether it's the Americans who... this is a big intervention, but it's a relatively late intervention if you compare it with the Chinese, who've been quietly and significantly putting money into these sectors for over a decade. And now here's not the place to work out whether these subsidies constitute anti-WTO sort of provisions that require a response in a trade war. But what is clear is that a vast amount of saving and investment in China has gone into this space. Equally, the EU's response to the IRA is not the first thing the Europeans have done in this area. So we now have very significant government action around the world in these areas. You can lament that if you're a kind of free marketeer economist. You can worry about the waste. You can worry about government misdirecting public funds, but it's happening. What does that mean for the UK? Well, I think we don't need to be, we're small to medium-sized open economy. We don't have to be competitive in every single sector. We won't be. We shouldn't try to be. We have to choose strategically the areas where we think we've got a current base to build upon and that are strategically likely to yield good jobs and good profits effectively for the firms operating those spaces in the years to come. There's a tool online called the Green Transition Navigator that you can look at country by country, looking at the current area of competitive advantage and where the adjacent spaces may be. And I think we in the UK need to be clear-eyed about the fact that we're not going to win in all of these areas. In some cases, I'd say the boat has sailed. Various boats have been sailing in the last 5 years. We had a remarkable moment with COVID, with interest rates at rock bottom, where we could have borrowed for a long time at almost nothing and done a massive investment in a green recovery. It wasn't entirely brown, but it fell far short, Chair, to your point about the paper that we did in the Oxford Review of what was possible, and I think that is a disappointment. But that doesn't mean that there won't be another boat that sails. Rates won't probably stay this high in real terms forever. They will come down, and there'll be a moment to do this sort of investment at the scale that others are doing relatively.
You mentioned the fact that we shouldn't look to be globally competitive in every single net zero sector.
Right.
You want to mention perhaps what net zero sectors we should be looking at and what the government could possibly do to enhance the UK's competitiveness in these net zero industries?
Yeah, you could write various papers in response. The Green Transition Navigator will help you look into the detail, but at a very high level, we've clearly got comparative advantage in wind technology and offshore wind. Floating, Hannah mentioned, I think that is an area of massive potential future growth. We have a competitive advantage in bioenergy and carbon capture in the form of DRAX. You can argue about whether that's a good idea. You can argue about whether it can and should be scaled up. But it's a space where we are currently leading and have knowledge and technology there. So CCS, there's some capabilities in this country in hydrogen. And there's lots of these. Remember this, we are a services powerhouse of an economy. And the services sector around this transition is incredibly strong, whether it's the green finance, the chief executive consulting and advisory space. That doesn't bring you a big manufacturing base in the north of the country, but it is an area of our comparative advantage that I think we can continue to grow as the transition plays out.
The UK was at risk of the UK falling behind other climate progressive developed economies without comprehensive action to address the UK's low carbon competitiveness. This was a statement made in June 2023 by the Climate Change Committee. Do you agree with the word of the statement?
Yeah, in broad thrust, absolutely, I do. And I think, as I say, there are some areas where falling behind may not matter so much, and there are other areas where it really does matter. It's not my job to tell you which ones are which, but I think we do. The CCC is right. We've had a year that hasn't been a particularly brilliant one for this agenda, and if you look at the progress reports for performance on the coming couple of carbon budgets, they look more at risk now than they did 12 months ago.
Huh?
I would agree that we need to accelerate progress if we are to deliver our ambition to achieve net zero. I would highlight, though, some of the strengths that we can build on. Professor Hepburn, you referred to our world-leading financial and professional services. We also have a reputation for rule of law. We then have our geography, expertise in a number of sectors. So those give us a very good foundation on which to build. I think what we would like to see is the government making progress on that national transition plan also taking the opportunity to build on other areas where we've been a world leader. The TFT disclosure framework is genuinely world leading. That's an opportunity for the UK to show competitiveness in a slightly different domain. We also need to make progress on a green taxonomy. Again, that's an opportunity for us to help give more confidence to investors and also to customers so that they know that the investments that they're making are indeed in green and sustainable industries and technologies.
Okay, Mark Woolsey. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in what the UK strengths and weaknesses are. And Professor Hepburn, you just gave us a list of areas where the UK has competitive advantage, being offshore wind, bioenergy, CCS and hydrogen. But I wonder if I could ask Hannah first, if I may. You mentioned that you've got UK investors who are very, very willing to invest in the UK. Are you going after Professor Cameron's list, or do you have a different target zone?
The areas that we chose to focus on were essentially to avoid boiling the ocean, because we could have put the 100 billion towards any areas of the economy, and we thought those would be ones where we might be able to make reasonable progress in a short time frame. The forum itself is intended to be only for 12 months, with a final report coming out in early July. We have done a lot of work engaging with many stakeholders to identify that project pipeline I've referred to. I think, one of the opportunities that we see for the UK government is to learn some lessons from the Inflation Reduction Act in the States and the EU Green Deal, which is really exploring blended finance opportunities. Blended finance is a way in which you can crowd in more investment, and that's very important for insurers because our risk profile is quite different from that of, say, a bank. Because we're investing over multiple decades, we need that steady, predictable rate of return. If we can find ways, working with the government, there are opportunities to bring in new types of institutional investment at earlier stages of different projects across multiple sectors. But I can't say that we have
So that would be as a part investor in a joint approach, is that what you're saying?
Depends at what point in the investment cycle. I think we've seen an interesting pilot opportunity emerge around EV charge points. At the moment, those are being deployed across different areas of the country. The government's got an ambition to get 300,000 charge points by 2030. But at the moment, these are largely funded by subsidies. We are currently working with the Green Finance Institute to see can we develop a model that would enable the subsidy or grant to be moved to either a government or a UK infrastructure-backed loan that would then enable insurers to contribute also to that upfront investment. And the hope would be over time, as that market matures, that the government support could fall away entirely. So that's one area where we're looking to see can we come up with new innovative ways of blended finance arrangements.
Yeah, and do you agree with Professor Hepburn about these areas of comparative advantage? Presumably you'd invest in those rather than the areas that Professor Cameron describes as where the boat has sailed.
As an industry, we always have to look for what will give us the best balance of risk and return, given we are investing for people's futures. We have to have regard to the return. But equally, we want to support a just transition, and this is where that national transition plan from the government is so critical.
And would you see investment opportunities in other countries, or are your funds exclusively targeted at UK investments?
The reason we focused our forum efforts on the UK is that it seemed, from my perspective, a very odd policy outcome if the government changed the UK prudential regulatory framework for insurers that simply enabled money to flow out of the country. We wanted to see what investment we could look to generate within the UK.
You want to get the best return for your investors, and the best return may not be in the UK. What would happen in those circumstances?
It would be, as happens today, that we would have a diversified portfolio.
So what would encourage you to put a greater proportion of your portfolio right now in the UK? What needs to happen?
We need greater certainty that decisions made today will hold not just tomorrow, but in 5, 10, 20 years' time.
Okay, well, give me an example of a decision that's been made that isn't holding for 5 years.
I think we've seen delays to decisions about Sizewell C, for example, that may have led to some uncertainty around whether that is an appropriate investment opportunity for the industry. Obviously, it's a matter for individual businesses, but the fact that nuclear industry can now have this regulated asset-based model, which has proved effective for other infrastructure projects, such as the Thames Tideway Tunnel, would seem that it would, in theory, be a good match for insurers. But as I say, there have been delays around some of the decisions in that area.
The decisions taken on home heating and the EV mandate, would you consider those as being reasons why you might choose not to invest in those areas?
I think we see those as areas where we want to work collaboratively to see can we create solutions so that we can get that risk-return profile a better fit for insurers and long-term savings providers.
Professor Hepburn, you did speak about the boat having sailed. Tell us where, what are the examples? Where has the boat sailed? Is automotive one of those?
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, I think it's not yet. It's in peril. You're seeing vast arrays of very cheap EVs coming out of China that we are not going to compete with that particular market segment very easily. But there, of course, is huge opportunity for the UK car industry, the brands that are much loved by consumers here and all around the world, so I wouldn't write them off yet. I'd like to just note that I'm not sure that the definitive Hepburn list of sectors where we have a comparative advantage was the one that I set out earlier. There'll be some more in that list. It was, I'd like to do my best to answer questions that they're asked of me. I mean, I would certainly add to that list. We have phenomenal world-beating capability in science and research and development, not just in this area, obviously, across the board, but in this area as well. And if we could do a better job of using that expertise to both create the ventures and then scale the ventures in a way that keeps the IP and the equity in the UK, we'd be in better shape too.
But where else have we missed opportunities? Where have we not been ready fast enough to take advantage of the green transition?
Well, I think for various reasons we don't exactly have a thriving onshore wind business. There's every reason to have thought that, if you go back 20 years, could the UK have built out a world-leading wind turbine business so that they're not located in Denmark, Germany and China? They're the countries you think of, Vestas and the others. Why aren't we on that list? We've got great expertise in turbines for jet engines and the rest of it, Rolls-Royce and others. So I'm pretty confident saying the boat sailed there and we weren't on it. But look, I mean, I'm giving you examples off the top of my head here rather than doing prefer to have a proper study.
Right, and on hydrogen, big opportunities there. We seem to be making progress on transport in hydrogen, but the government's not going to make a decision on domestic heating until 2016. So is that in the missed out list, or is that in the areas of comparative advantage and opportunity?
Well, in my mind, at least, you just opened quite a big can of worms, because whether we should be using hydrogen in domestic home heating, I think, is a question to which I think the answer is probably no, for various reasons. Some to do with the second law of thermodynamics, and others to do with costs and supply chain. So, some boats sail, and you may not want to be on them. And perhaps that's one of them. In terms of hydrogen for transport, certainly for personal mobility, again, I'm not sure that's a boat the Japanese are particularly enjoying being on right now. Now, perhaps for more industrial, shipping, hydrogen and its related molecules, ammonia and methanol, that's somewhere where we can be thinking hard at this point.
And you mentioned that if we were to match the IRA, that would amount to £40 billion per annum investment by the UK. We're not going to get there, but there's plenty of research that suggests we should be putting in about 1% of GDP, which you gave us the figure of 25 billion. If we do that, where's it coming from?
Yeah, I mean, those figures are roughly right. And where's it coming from? Well, so at the moment, if you look at the structure of our savings and investment, not only, as I said earlier, not only do we invest less than comparable countries, a lot less.
We're not going to suddenly change our savings ratio, are we?
Well, dare I say the following in a political context. I do think we need fewer decaf oat lattes and a bit more on our insulation of our buildings, so less consumption and more investment. It's not a politically wonderful line. I mentioned it to a peer the other day.
We're a market economy and people do what they want to do, don't they?
Well, of course, they
buy lattes.
And they should buy their lattes, and I do as well. But I think what we can do at the government level is to structure the set of incentives at the economy. So
how do we encourage that change?
Right. So that's the right question. So that we're not such miserable savers, as I say, right at the bottom of the list.
And perhaps that hand, I'll ask you. I think the customers there, the consumer is aware of the nature of transition, bearing in mind that in many cases they are people who are investing in pension funds. Are they aware of the magnitude of investment and why it's important?
Probably not.
That's a great question, actually. So from a customer point of view, we do see through research that the individual firms undertake that there's an increasing interest in making sure that your savings and investments are directed towards sustainable ends. But at the same time, we also see in a study by Scottish Widows last year that around about 30% of people didn't know what a sustainable pension was. So there's a huge education need that I think we all need to get behind. Going back to the professor's point, though, just about savings, if I think about it from a pension adequacy point of view, one of the key areas of focus for the ABI over a period of many years has been looking at the future of auto-enrolment, because while it has been a success in many ways with millions of people saving into pensions that they otherwise wouldn't have, the contribution rates are not sufficient to enable people to have the retirements that they deserve. It doesn't matter how good a rate of return that we're able to generate. It would need to be a Herculean rate of return in order to match the difference between a defined contribution pension versus defined benefit pension. So I think there is also a need to work collectively, public and private sector, to help educate people on why saving matters. And in fact, that's a campaign that we've started in partnership with the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association called Pension Attention. We launched that 2 years ago. We're in the throes of preparing our third year with a soon-to-be announced ambassador, but the aim is to really catch people's attention across different demographics and get us all focused on saving more.
Would you favour, in addition to pension enrolment, focus purely and exclusively on the green transition? Is that something that your customers, your consumers would be happy to adhere to?
I think what customers want is choice, so we need to help educate them on what are the investment choices available to them so that they can then select them in a way that's simple and easy to implement.
The point I'm trying to get from you is that are they ready to earmark that for this green transition that we're talking about, or are they simply interested in the best possible return to provide them with the best possible retirement?
We do see some customers actually who prioritise the transition over the rate of return, and there are various online tools and applications that enable customers to decide which type of fund they want to invest in.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I'm going to bring in Jane in a sec, but can I just check, if we're trying to mobilise the money that we need, I mean, 100 billion that is devoted to this, Hannah, is about 10 billion a year. It was 100 billion over 10 years, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So UK business investment last year is about 270 billion. So the kind of fund, if it's running out at 10 billion a year, that's only about 4% of total UK business investment. That seems quite a small number compared to the grand total of the investment that we need. How do you think about that investment gap?
So the investment gap is a really important issue, and I'm glad you've asked the question. Just in terms of the 100 billion, this relates specifically to investments that are going to be enabled by reforms to Solvency UK. Analysis that the ABI undertook back in 2021 suggested that the industry would be able to contribute up to a third of the investment needed to get to 2035 carbon reduction targets, which equates to about 60 billion a year. So the 100 billion is almost like a slightly different pot.
Yeah, okay.
And in fact, there was research produced yesterday that suggests if we're able to tackle some of the barriers to investment, the pensions industry might be able to contribute as much as a half towards the investment that's needed.
So we're still missing a half to two-thirds of the investment that we need.
Which is why I think those blended finance models and looking at new types of approach with government is so important.
So the IMF has published quite recently a framework for helping governments think about the way that they put public money in. So there's good old-fashioned grant And then on the sell side, there are a range of instruments like tax credits, full expensing, good old-fashioned corporation tax cuts. And then on the buy side, there are consumer grants, there's consumer tax incentives as well. To what degree do you think your members are able to come to a consensus about the optimum mix of how public money goes in through those instruments?
I'm not sure that my members would achieve consensus on that. I think what they would like to see from government is a roadmap on what investment is needed when, so that they can plan what investment they'll be able to provide year on year for different types of projects that meet their particular needs in terms of risk and return.
If government is putting aside, say, let's say for the sake of argument, £28 billion in public investment into helping support the transition to a green economy, what would your members say to government about the way that money should come into the economy?
They would want to have a conversation and recognising that it's not just our industry that's part of the equation here. You have other types of financial institution, you have philanthropic bodies as well.
Yeah.
All of our interests and our intended outcomes will be slightly different.
Okay, but what you're not saying is just put all of the money on corporation tax cuts.
I think you need to look at these issues in the round. I know that there have been some previous witnesses who've talked about the need to look at the tax environment. Certainly, I do know that from an industry perspective, we like to have certainty for as long as possible around the tax environment. Yeah. There may be different types of incentive that need to be thought of quite laterally, actually, in terms of the question that was asked earlier about job creation and how do you incentivise this in different regions. There may be a need to think about tax incentives to bring particular skills and professions into certain regions so that can become a thriving hub.
Okay, so there's no kind of obvious answer.
Well, I think there is an answer. The way I think about this is that our fiscal space is limited. Mm-hmm. If you're going to spend 28 billion or any other number between 10 and 30 a year, then you have to do it in a way that you spend it wisely in a way that the private sector will have difficulty to do itself. So part of this is around identifying where the economies of scale or the increasing returns are in the economy and grabbing them, aligning it with your strategy about where you want to be to have a comparative advantage in the future. Another space is in infrastructure, where actually, yes, the private sector does like to invest in infrastructure, but only if the risks are really low. One of the things our report coming out in the next week will say is that the public sector investment requirement can be reduced rather significantly if the government gets the right policy mix, because ultimately this is about capital flowing where it needs to flow. If you design, if you stop subsidising things that you don't want to have happen, which we still do quite a lot of, and you don't have to simply subsidise things you do happen to increase the returns, you can design policy that reduces the risk. You can design these sort of blended finance mechanisms. So infrastructure and areas where there is a fairly urgent need to capture or retain advantage in an area that we think is strategically important.
Jane.
Following on from that point then, we seem to be focusing on big banks putting big money into things that big ticket, things like wind, CCS, hydrogen, etc. But what about the small engineering business in the middle of Loughborough that makes widgets? How do they get investment in order to get to net zero?
You want to?
Well, I will say that one of, again, my observations since we mobilised the Investment Delivery Forum is that the scale of investment that we're talking about on behalf of the industry I represent, which are not banks, they are insurers and pension providers, the scale of investment is very large, and we need large projects in which we can invest. So I think your question is probably not one for me or my industry to answer, because there are challenges just to do with the amount of money that we need to invest targeting individual companies of the kind that you've described.
Professor Hepburn, if the money is being taken into large projects by Hannah's organisation for whatever reason, what is then happening to those small businesses where, after all, most people are actually employed in this country? Yeah,
look, I think it's a very important question, and whether those businesses can access the capital that they need to grow and expand, it will depend, again, upon whether their investors think there are appropriate risk-adjusted returns for those sorts of firms. And that will depend upon the enabling and the surrounding policy environment, and whether they are playing in an industrial ecosystem that looks like it's set to grow or looks like it's set to go out of business. So if you, as I'm sure you probably saw in America on your trip, when you have such a large and targeted program of the sort that we see over there with the IRA, you're effectively intervening within industrial ecosystems. So yes, you're focused on these various big prizes, but as you lift the ecosystem so that it becomes more competitive, your SMEs who are playing in that ecosystem will also benefit, and one would hope be able to find more better access to capital. I mean, there's another discussion to be had about the banking system, business banking system in the UK, but perhaps that's not for now, and how well it does financing SMEs compared to, say, in Germany or other countries.
Okay, so it tends to go back to the Chairman's first question about jobs. And you were saying there was going to be a lot of jobs. There might be a lot of jobs in the new industries, but that actually might be forgoing those in the older industries. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, so there are some winners and losers. The jobs figures I gave are net figures, I think, for the most part. And inevitably, in the industries that are sunset industries, there'll be sunset jobs there. And I think as with the capital turnover story, where you don't want to scrap assets before they've reached the end of their life. But when they do reach the end of their life, you want to make sure that fossil assets are replaced with clean assets, so you're not wasting money. Similar sorts of things can be said about people's real lives and their working careers. You ideally want to train up a generation so that they're ready for the jobs of the future, and phase down the jobs that actually we're simply not going to need in 50 years' time, so you're not suddenly having to fire large numbers of people because a company's gone out of business because it hasn't seen the transition coming, even though it's been on its way for decades.
Not necessarily the case, of course, that we won't need widgets anymore. It's just that they won't get the funding to get to net zero, but there we are. Thank you.
Ian Lavery, do you want to come in very briefly on the...
Just very briefly. Obviously, there's huge challenges and trade-offs ahead for the government. What are them to ensure that we have a just transition to net zero? What do you think the main challenges and perhaps trade-offs might be?
I think a lot of them do relate to the labour market and the skills challenges. So we're a long way behind on skills now, whether it's heating engineers who can do heat pumps rather than gas boilers or other domains. So skilling up ahead of time before we have a labour market crunch and we find that the transition is delayed because we don't have the jobs and actually people aren't ready to get jobs that are there and are waiting for them, that's important. But then, as I said right at the start, we'll have a challenge towards the back end of the mid-century when a lot of the capital has been built out and those jobs are no longer needed. You do have a higher level of steady-state jobs, but we will be skilling people up and then after 10 or 20 years not needing them anymore. Now that is half a career, but I think we have to be, in terms of the justice of the transition, really acutely aware of its impacts on labour around the country and aware, as you've been rightly focused some of your questions on the impacts across space and different geographical areas of the country as well.
And just finally, in last September, the Prime Minister announced extensions to the deadlines for phasing out the sale of new gas boilers, which you've just mentioned, and the new petrol and diesel cars and vans, stating, and this is what the Prime Minister actually said, if we continue down this path, we'll risk losing the consent of the British people. Was the Prime Minister right, and was the decision right? Is what he's saying right?
Well, he's right that consent is incredibly important here. Bringing people along with us is incredibly important. I'm not sure this was a decision that suddenly increased people's consent for the net zero transition. In terms of its direct impact on emissions and our ability to hit our goals, it's negative but not huge, those two delays. I think my stronger concern is the message it sends, to Hannah's point, about policy certainty, credibility, longevity, strategic focus, etc., and direction. And indeed, those sorts of changes that are negative changes to the path that we know we have to go on actually risk losing us jobs and reducing consent, I would say, rather than supporting the clarity, the investment, the job creation that we need. But certainly the Prime Minister was right that public buy-in, public consent is incredibly important. And there's lots that we can do in many different parts of this transition to increase that. To give you one example, you have resistance to new power facilities in different parts of the country. Why? Well, because there's no obvious benefit. What we see in other countries is when communities benefit from cheaper electricity, they're desperate to have the wind farm or the local bit of kit in their locality, because it will reduce costs for them and yield benefits. So I think it's not rocket science, but getting buy-in to these changes just requires sharing the benefits with those who are participating.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just make a sort of macro point, which is that my observation is that as an industry, we have a very long-term time horizon. We're talking 50, 60 plus years. And that puts us at odds quite often with the political cycle. And I think one of the challenges that we have is short-termism. And we need to find a way of introducing a long-term perspective. I don't pretend to have the answer to this. I recognise it is politically very challenging. But that's what's essential, that when a decision is made, that we've got confidence that that decision is going to last over the long term. One suggestion that we've made in our policy programme document is around empowering some of the executive agencies and bodies such as the OBR, potentially giving them a greater level of independence and also an obligation to look at the multiplier effect of the benefit of good long-term investment. And potentially that would also be supported by a new fiscal policy committee that would look not just at the risks of investment, but also at the risks of not investing, because I think we don't think about that often enough. If I put it in a personal context, we're always so worried about what if I put £100 into my current account, I won't lose any money. But equally, by not putting it into a shares ISA, for example, I'm potentially losing out. We often focus on the near and now, rather than actually what are the long-term potential benefits of investing for job creation, public assets. So that would be my hope, that we can find a way to introduce a long-termism approach to this agenda, because it's just too important for us as a country not to do it.
Okay, clock is slightly against us. That's been an incredibly helpful session. You've basically said that the transition to net zero is going to create jobs overall. Many of those will be good jobs. We're not 100% clear where they will be, and so we're not clear whether they will be in places where there are skills gaps, but there are going to be some sectors that are obvious winners, like energy, buildings, transport, wind, biomass, CCS, potentially hydrogen. There are some sectors that potentially are in a bit of peril. There is going to be an investment gap, and therefore there is going to need to be public money that goes in, but to maximise the private sector contribution, we're going to need a long-term strategy or a net transition plan, as you called it, Hannah. There may be some problems around particular sectors like buildings and retrofitting. We probably need to see a bit more on that, but faster decisions and consistent decisions will help. We're going to need blended finance models that are probably context specific, and a big theme from what you've said has been the emphasis that you've put on a major plan for helping the labour market adapt and make the most of the opportunities to come. So that has been a brilliant session. Thank you so much indeed for evidence. Do please send us things that you think we would benefit from as we draw up our recommendations, but for now, that's that. Order.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Indeed.
It was excellent.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. Welcome to the second panel of today's Business and Trade Select Committee inquiry into the industrial strategy that we need for the transition to net zero. Thank you so much indeed to our witnesses for joining us from across British industry. I'm going to kick off and we're going to try and move through the questions quite quickly. But Carl, perhaps I could just start with you, and it will be the same question to each of you, if you wouldn't mind just answering as briefly and as concisely as you can. Could you tell us, is the transition to net zero, in your view, going to create jobs? And do we need an industrial strategy from government to help navigate this great shift that we've got to make? Carl?
I think, yes, definitely it will create jobs because we need to upskill and retrain a lot of the sector. Not so much in the manufacturing side. So from a manufacturing perspective, we've got that capability and that competence in-house. My comments are more directed towards the installer section of the industry.
Yep.
We have something like 130,000 gas-registered installers. Installers in the UK employed by 55,000 companies, and that tells you they're very small micro businesses in the main, and therefore getting to them to upskill them is a challenge. But our company and many of the boiler manufacturers and heat pump manufacturers training installers all the time. So we're training 2,000-3,000 installers on heat pumps currently a year at the moment, and that number rises to 15,000 when we talk about.
So from your view, good for jobs?
Good for jobs, definitely.
Yeah. Duncan?
Yeah, good for jobs. I mean, offshore wind, as an example, has already grown to 30,000. This is an industry which didn't exist that long ago, and we can see it growing to more than 100,000 by the end of the decade. And I think when you look around the world at what's happening to offshore wind, there is actually an even bigger opportunity to go beyond that. If we can attract and be successful in competing for more of the manufacturing, then those numbers can be higher.
Does an industrial strategy help you navigate the future?
I think if we want to have a competitive offer for what are global supply chains to make their investments here, then I think a holistic approach which looks at skills at reasonable cost, looks at the business environment, looks at the infrastructure. I think one of the things for offshore wind, as one example, is that it needs ports. So ports investments, infrastructure investments are the sorts of things which make those a decisionable opportunity for a global manufacturer.
Yeah. James?
I think broadly yes, but with a caveat. And I think that caveat's around UK supply chain and what those jobs and where those jobs are. As an EPC installer, so we operate across hydrogen, solar, variety of other clean energy sectors. A lot of our supply chain at the moment is based outside the UK. We may talk about it later, but competition from IRA in America, European investment, means that some of those supply chains and skills are establishing themselves outside of the UK. Therefore, I think there's a need for industrial strategy that focuses on development of UK supply chain and UK jobs.
Interesting. We've just heard from Professor Hepburn that retrofitting in buildings will be probably the biggest single sector of job creation. And you're saying that actually we may need some help just onshoring some of that supply chain?
I think in part, yes. So I think retrofit, there are a larger number of UK jobs that will come from that and UK skills. But if I look at, perhaps, I think it was Professor Hepburn that was talking about some of those sunset industries. If we don't reskill and invest in UK supply chain quickly, we may find some of those jobs are offshored outside of the UK. So I'm thinking particularly, we talked about hydrogen and CCUS. So, for example, hydrogen supply chain is starting to establish itself in the electrolyser market outside of the UK. There are UK startups, but they aren't typically well placed to take on industrial scale schemes.
Okay, James? I'm sorry, Alistair?
I agree with everything that's kind of been said already by the panel, but ultimately to answer your question directly, yes. I think the point at the end of the last session where we talked about the transition from work is going to be particularly important in terms of where the kind of winners and losers end in that kind of space. and we need to make sure that's kind of appropriately kind of there's a plan in place for that, and there's appropriately kind of any mitigations that are kind of put in place. But I think kind of to Duncan's point around ensuring that kind of all levers of government policy are pointing in the right direction is going to be critically important to making the kind of the most out of the opportunity that's coming for the UK.
So good for jobs, but we need an industrial strategy to help steer the path. Yeah, okay, thank you. Andy MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. James, you've already touched upon this to a very large degree. It's about where the global competitive nature around these technologies has changed following the IRA and the European Green Deal. Has anybody else got any thoughts about what evidence they've seen of that shift? Because we're trying to get a handle on this, how effective it's been. Duncan, do you want to?
Yes, I mean, as the momentum has been building to decarbonise electricity around the world, we've seen a massive growth in the competition for capital, for skills, for supply chain. That has led to some constraints. I think when we look at the IRA in the US and the Green Deal in Europe, that's added and amplified to that. We've seen that it can really work. It intensifies that competition. We've also seen that you can get it wrong, and if you put a really strong and attractive mechanism like that, it can be a massive draw for investment and attention, but you can also get it wrong if you don't have a realistic, can be stretching, but a realistic pathway to actually make physical things happen. If you want to create new manufacturing, new supply chains, then that needs to be visible, otherwise neither will happen, neither the investment nor the infrastructure that relies on it.
So there's some warning signs there. You're touching upon my next question really, around design and implementation of these plans. I mean, are we seeing things that you think will work, and definitely, and then on the contrary, things we shouldn't be doing? But are there any things that we could pinch from that structure? I don't know, Alistair.
Maybe to start, I think the reality is that I think it was touched on before as well. Kind of the US and Europe, China, all coming at this from kind of slightly different contexts, and so clearly, as been kind of mentioned a few times, we're not going to kind of compete pound for pound with the US in terms of direct subsidy, and nor should we. I think we need to kind of lean into the strengths that we have here in the UK. I think we've had kind of stable investable policy mechanisms in place that have drawn in a lot of capital, but it's how do we make sure that those policy and regulatory frameworks that we have in place can be kind of reorientated to support kind of industrial strategy, because I think there's been a bit of a trade-off at the moment around kind of maybe an over-focus on near-term cost over long-term value.
Anybody want to add?
I'll just add a comment. Really, when you start looking at electrification of heat and heat pumps, the outdoor units particularly, I doubt whether we'll be manufacturing those locally in the UK or even locally in Europe. They're already being supplied and sourced from China, from the Far East, because effectively they're an air conditioning unit running in reverse. So the typical Chinese air conditioning manufacturers are dominating that market. Where we're looking to secure manufacturing context for the UK market is then the rest of the system that we need to add to that outdoor unit. All the equipment inside the property is where we'll focus our attention.
I think in the last 5 years, we've bought major contracts with more than 230 UK companies for our offshore wind farms, and a quarter of those we've then taken overseas, where we're building offshore wind farms around the world. So it can be done, and we do have a foundation. The policy framework we've got here in energy is respected. It gives us a strong, relatively mature supply base to start with. But what we're looking at is a trebling or even quintupling of the size of that supply chain in the decade to come. That's an enormous opportunity. And the way we should be looking at it is to say, well, where have we got a strong enough foundation that we can be competitive and make an offer to supply chain companies where they make the choice? Well, we've got something here. There's an environment that's stable. It's predictable. It's inviting. We can be successful here. We can make a fair return for the investment that we're going to make, and identify the areas where we can be attractive like that. And there are some. We've seen good examples of everything from turbine blades through to high voltage cables. And if you're a manufacturer, it's often the case that the lowest risk, best proposition for making your next big investment in capacity is where you see a track record.
I'll just make two quick points, if that's okay. I think I generally agree. I think with what Carl was saying. I think if you look at UK manufacturing, 9% of GDP is associated with manufacturing output. That jumps to close to 18% when you look at specialist technology-led manufacturing. And so it's that rest of the system, so those specialist components that we think is where industrial strategy will drive jobs in UK supply chain. I think that the part that then underpins that I would then reference is skills. We may come on to that later in the conversation. But in order to make that industrial strategy land, we need access to the right skills in the UK to support the growth of those innovative supply chains.
Douglas, Frank.
Yeah, it was just really a question on the back of the chair's initial question. I think, Duncan, you mentioned about the access to port facilities and infrastructure around that. I just wondered, from Alistair's point of view and Duncan, does in the absence of an industrial strategy as we have it at the moment, does the introduction of free ports or green ports in Scotland, does that make any difference in terms of not just the availability of infrastructure, but some of the tax incentives that are around those areas as well? And is that enough, or would you like government to have that underpinning industrial strategy as well to give you a real clear vision of what the future might be for your industry, especially in offshore wind, for example?
Yeah, maybe I'm just going to start off on that. I think it's one of many levers that government devolves, governments have at their disposal, and ultimately, if we're talking about a coherent industrial strategy that's going to deliver the best outcomes for UK PLC, we're going to need all of these pulling in the right direction. Clearly, there's a whole range of opportunities that Scotland has in the energy transition. We as a company are planning to invest £40 billion over the next decade. 20 billion of that is due to be in Scotland. So we see a huge opportunity. But I suppose from the how do you deliver on that, it's the free ports are obviously one element where there are direct incentives, but how is there direct investment in the port infrastructure that's going to be needed to deploy future of offshore wind turbines, notably floating offshore wind and ScotWind? How are the networks going to be built to connect those assets into the system? What are the flexible technologies that are going to be needed to do that? Ultimately, with all of the deployment of these, it's going to need a whole range of levers, all pulling in the same direction. And actually, I think if we maybe look back in terms of how the UK has performed, it has performed well in certain areas, but it's maybe not captured the maximum opportunity from the investment it's taken to date because it hasn't had all of those levers pulling in the same direction.
Duncan,
yeah, I'd agree with that. Green ports and free ports are really good, a good measure, and I think we've seen quite a few. We saw a sector deal for offshore wind a few years ago, and we've seen a number of rounds of grant funding. But this next phase is more intense. The competition's more intense. The stakes are bigger. The tickets are bigger. So we need to do something different and something more here. And I think that all levers aligned, that more holistic approach, with a mindset of what's the decision that a manufacturing investor is going to have to make to put it here. What are they going to need to see? Yes, it's skills, it's a workforce, it's the infrastructure they need. It might be planning permissions. It's almost certainly, for offshore wind at least, a deep water quayside. So we can help make that an easier decision. We can take risk away, and we can show the pathway for what's needed physically.
Is there anything you specifically need from government to allow that, to make your job easier, or to make that investment decisions easier? What would it be? What would be the...
Start with the ports. Get the port investments going, get that infrastructure invested so that the deep water quaysides are there, so that the access to power and a skilled workforce are there. That would be a great platform to start with.
Okay, we're going to come back on this question over the course of the next questions. Ian Lavery.
Just briefly, how is international competition across the supply chains affecting the delivery of the projects here in the UK? Anybody?
Happy to start. I think from an Equans perspective, we look at supply chains that cover solar, EV charging, hydrogen electrolyzers, and in all three of those areas in the last 18 months, 2 years, we've seen some significant challenges in availability. That is starting to improve, but all of our supply chains for those key bits of kit are coming from outside of the UK, and we are seeing demand, particularly for hydrogen electrolyzers. We are having to try and place orders well in advance of achieving final investments decisions, which is having an impact on the ability to deliver projects as planned. So the answer is yes, there is an impact on project delivery.
Anybody else?
Maybe to come in on that point, I think ultimately, clearly supply chain in certain components is tight, and that's driven by ambition here in the UK, but elsewhere. But I think actually one person's supply chain tightness is another person's supply chain opportunity. To deliver on the ambition that's needed, in the UK and elsewhere, there's going to need to be new supply chain capacity. And I think the kind of particular plea that we would make from policymakers is actually how can we help enable developers of UK infrastructure to be able to have early and at scale engagement with the supply chain to actually trigger those new supply chain capacity investments here in the UK. I think when we look across the kind of GB energy policy and regulatory framework, actually over the last kind of 10 to 15 years we've had a lot of success in deployment of offshore wind and phasing out coal, but actually in terms of capturing that supply chain we've not done as well as we could do. Primarily because the frameworks that have been put in place have effectively fragmented our ability to have those early and at-scale engagements with supply chain. And I'd maybe point to one area where there has been recent success, recently as last week, is on electricity transmission. So what happened there is that to meet the kind of government's 2030 offshore wind ambition, a strategic plan was put in place by the Electricity System Operator, the ESO, that then enabled a scalable plan for investment for the electricity transmission owners, of which we're one in the north of Scotland, which has then enabled the supply chain to see that visibility of that pipeline, but also see firm contractable orders that they can actually invest against. And that's why we've kind of seen the recent investment from Japanese industrial conglomerate Sumitomo in high voltage manufacturing capability up at the Port of Nigg, up in the Scottish Highlands, that will kind of create 300 good green jobs.
From our side, supply chains have settled down now. We immediately post-COVID period, we had big issues with electronic semiconductor availability. That's all calmed right back down now, and so as I speak today, touch wood, no supply chain issues at the moment.
And there's definitely constraints. We're coming through a very difficult period since the invasion of Ukraine, but I agree with what Alistair was saying. It's really about opportunity now, and I think maybe we should just remind ourselves that success won't mean us winning in all parts of it. There will be areas where we can get a foothold, where we've got a very strong foundation as a starting point. That's what we should build on, and that will be success. We don't have to be in or dominate all parts of all chains. You need part of it where you can add value. And I think the other thing is, when you're successful, and not all of it will work out. Let's be realistic. We'll chase more than we actually succeed with, but where it works out, we have to help it through its whole life cycle. So getting a new bit of industry up and running is a challenging phase. It needs help with managing risk. It needs help with getting started, making investments. Getting a new manufacturing facility up and running is hard work and can take years. And then it needs sustaining as well. So it's a very dynamic situation, and we need to be ready to be dynamic in response.
Mark Pawsey.
Thank you, Chair. I want to follow up on the line of questioning that Douglas Chapman started, and that's the impact of the United States IRA and the Green Deal from the EU, and the challenge that faces. And in many ways, getting the message that this has been something of a game changer. And so my question revolves around how should the UK respond? And Duncan, you sort of spoke about investment in skills, which we've traditionally been pretty difficult with. Getting apprenticeships underway hasn't been brilliant. You spoke about a planning system. We hear project after project go down the planning system. So, frankly, those are not great advantages that we've got. You were very positive about the investment in ports, but I'm wondering if I might ask our other witnesses, what should we do in the face of this challenge that's posed from the US and from Europe? So, Carl, can I start with you? What would you, if you were in government, how would you deal with that? How would you respond to that challenge?
I think the main issue to focus on from our side is manufacturing is a long-term investment game. And we need, therefore, an industrial strategy that gives us that guidance and that framework to work in on that long-term basis. And particularly in recent times, we've had so many changes in government, changes in officials, and changes to those policies. Manufacturing is a long-term investment, and we need that long-term thinking.
The stability of policy.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Duncan, I've got yours as ports. James.
I would largely with Carl around stability and policy, and I think that stability and policy will encourage that investment and give confidence in establishing those industries and manufacturing.
Do you see any sign of that emerging?
So there are clearly areas of positivity. So we're involved in the HAR1 funding rounds, and we can see a really kind of clear hydrogen policy. But that does come with risk if we don't ensure that support doesn't flow down through the supply chain.
We're not going to make a decision on hydrogen in heating for
not in heating. No, I'm talking about industrial.
That's hardly certainty of policy.
So from our perspective, though, we're focused on industrial decarbonisation, where we do see a route for hydrogen, less so for domestic. But that's just one area I can see there is government support that is working with a comparison to Europe, where
so
you see
a strong route from government.
Correct. And if you look at the current strike price for hydrogen in the HAR1 round versus Europe, we've come in at a higher price, which will encourage or give us likely success of more projects than we may see across in Europe.
Okay, and Alistair, how should we respond?
So I think made that first point around embedding strategic energy infrastructure and making sure the policy and regulatory framework aligns with that. Addressing delivery barriers, I think planning and consenting is creating all sorts of delays and issues for infrastructure projects, and remove overhanging uncertainty that are feeding into investments.
And can I ask you, what are we good at? What are our strengths in this area, and why would people invest here? And are there areas where we've missed out on investment, and what might we do to deal with that? So, for example, we have heard about our equivocal approach to onshore wind. So we haven't invested in onshore wind. But what are we good at? Where are our strengths?
So I think we're talking purely technologies. I think there are opportunities in floating offshore wind, high voltage direct current cabling, and CCS and hydrogen. And kind of focusing on those four, and in particular the components and manufacturing parts of that sector are going to be pretty important for delivering those, and where we have comparative advantage will be an important thing to do. But I'd also echo the point around the service economy. It's not just about jobs here in London that are servicing the kind of the green transition. Actually, there's a lot of jobs in the Central Belt in Scotland around the kind of renewables industry, be it in finance or kind of legal professions, that are going to be critical for delivering that. So leaning into those, but I would say those are the four technologies that I would call out as particularly important.
And James, I have a question to you, and I was going to respond to the point that we're brilliant at developing new ideas, but not always brilliant at seeing that through to volume manufacture. What else can we be good at? How can we really seize the opportunities here?
I agree in terms of technologies, and I think it is a challenge that the UK's faced in terms of bringing those through to that volume manufacturing stage. And I think my point earlier about investment in areas where we have that comparative advantage in the supply chain, I think it was Duncan that made the point that we don't need all of the supply chain, we need part of that supply chain. So that technology-led manufacturing on component parts of each technology, whether that's CCUS, whether that's hydrogen, will deliver strength, and that's where I think we can gain some competitive advantage. I think finally if we look at solar, so we have a very strong capability to design, build and install solar, but we don't own or we don't deliver much of that supply chain apart from labour in the UK, and that's an example where perhaps something has got away because there wasn't early enough investment in the UK to create that supply chain.
Why didn't that early investment take place?
To be honest, I suspect that was probably down to policy uncertainty, a large number of broader distractions in the economy at the time that meant that actually the rest of the world accelerated. Some of that was also down to raw material availability for the panels themselves, but clearly mounting structures and other capabilities could be formed within the UK.
And Duncan, your assessment of strengths and weaknesses of the UK and challenges?
I would recommend actually the offshore wind, the industrial growth plan that was recently published by the Offshore Wind Industry Council together with Crown Estate Scotland, Crown Estate and Renewable UK. They really did a item by item analysis of where we have the capacity, the capability, the starting point, and made those selections. They've made 5 recommendations. It does include some of the smart in the operations phase, some of the turbine components like blades and cables. But actually, it's an item-by-item analysis. So, it's a roadmap for targeting our efforts.
And you told us about the sector deal. Did that help? And is it still helping now? Does it need revising? Does it need updating?
We're in a new world here. We're just entering a totally different phase. We talked about the IRA and just the scale of it globally now. It's just absolutely
we
ballooning.
Forget about the sector deal.
No, it's something to build on, and I think this IGP does build on that.
Okay, and Carl, your assessment?
Just a couple of comments. You've already said it. We're really good at innovation, transforming that innovation into then industrial.
That's been a long-term industrial problem in the UK, hasn't it?
It has.
Not going to change that overnight, are we?
But with hydrogen, we had that. We took a very early lead. We were showing that innovation. Those opportunities are starting to diminish now. But there's still an opportunity if we take some key decisions based on this long-term thinking. There's still an opportunity for us to show some leadership. Other countries are starting to catch up.
May I ask you, as a manufacturer of boilers, do you see an opportunity for hydrogen in the domestic heating area?
We see it's a multi-technology approach, so hydrogen has a part role to play in domestic heating, we believe, alongside other technologies.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I'm just going to take a moment to play a quick game now. So I'm going to give you £960 million, and I'm trying to get to net zero by 2050, and I'd like you to tell me how you're going to spend that 960 million. Just give me a sense of how you would cut the pie up in order to help me maximise investment and general progress towards my goal. Carl, do you want to start?
Thanks for coming to me first. I've partially said it just. This is a multi-technology approach. This challenge is not favouring one technology or another. We've got to develop and move forward with that multi-technology approach and take and apply some long-term thinking. And I think the part that we sometimes don't talk about around decarbonisation challenges is the energy security element of what we need to achieve. And when you then think about that as we move forward, it takes you down that multi-technology approach because it's too risky to put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, so I should be investing in a portfolio of technology. Yeah. And how much should I be spending on skills, do you think? Of my sort of large £1 billion pie, how much should I be putting into
a good chunk of it, probably 25%, 30%.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, Duncan.
And another 25 or 30%, I think you could invest really targeting a small number of high-profile,
Do you agree that about a quarter is going on skills then? Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Yes, and a similar amount, I think, in attracting probably a relatively small number of high-profile anchor investments in new manufacturing. It's going to need cultivating over a period of time. It's going to need developers and investors in energy assets working with the manufacturers over a period of time, helping them future-proof the investments they're going to make, helping them de-risk that. So national government, local authorities, the suppliers and the buyers have all got roles to play over an extended period of time.
Yeah.
And I think, we know it's competitive. Yeah. So, it's not going to be free to attract in some really big anchor investments, but we can do it, and we should once we can anchor some of those, I think a lot more will follow.
Very useful. And those are firms, right? Those are kind of anchor firms.
Yes. Yeah. That's clusters. You end up with clusters.
Yeah. James.
I've broadly gone a third. So I think kind of a third on, I call it high-profile projects, but where there's investment through the supply chain. I think the point I would make there is that it doesn't stop at developer level. and that it moves through the contracting chain, because you need those lower parts of the supply chain to have traction and to see reward and benefit rather than just accepting risk. I think part of that, the second third would be investing directly in that manufacturing, so supporting UK supply chain, and that might be that actually accepting that we have to pay more for UK supply chain in support of specific projects. And so when we are looking at assessment criteria, value for money may take a different meaning when we look at the proportion of UK supply chain. And then the final third kind of clearly in skills, so developing skills in the right areas for us to support that transition.
You would put local labour market content
quite high
conditions on.
Yes, absolutely, and I think there needs to be a glide path to get to that point, because if today that was the criteria for certain projects, you wouldn't be able to meet it.
Yeah, that's done.
So I think kind of the comments that we made, I kind of largely agree with them, but I suppose maybe to counteract the kind of perception of what we may be asking for. So I work for an offshore wind developer, electricity networks provider, but I would suggest that we kind of put more of the pots that we have available for manufacturing into things like CCS and hydrogen, because they need more of a kickstart than those other sectors do. But it's about how do you make sure that you leverage in all of the opportunities from offshore wind in electricity networks through the other routes that you have available to you through those kind of stable, investable kind of frameworks to make you get your biggest bang for your buck. You know, we're not here saying we need taxpayer money to do this, this and this. Actually, we need to do our fair share of the kind of skills development. What we're asking for is that longer term certainty that we can then invest in our skills pipeline to deliver on our investment plans going forward.
Very useful. Julie Marson.
Thank you, Chair. We've covered a lot of ground, particularly on supply chains, but we've got such a good range of sectors here. I want to make sure that everyone has drawn out, that we've really drawn out what you consider to be the key constraints and vulnerabilities, if you like, in your sector-specific supply chains. So without going over ground that we've already going, can I go down the line and make sure that we understand that in the supply chain from your industry?
So looking across electricity system, and Duncan will be looking at offshore wind, a kind of component of that. I think it's making sure that policy and regulation can enable us to have early and at scale engagements with the supply chain to trigger that supply chain investment capacity here in the UK.
Okay, thank you.
I think we occupy a slightly different part in supply chain because we are physically delivering a lot of these projects on the ground. So I think the point that I would raise is around that risk flow down. So as an EPC contractor, we don't always benefit from that top level investment and funding, but we are asked to carry the risk of success of delivery of a project. And so ensuring that that support is there throughout the supply chain to make sure that there are roles and organisations there that want to deliver innovative technologies is important.
Okay, thank you. Duncan?
I think it's been said, the framework of stable regulation creates a risk environment where you can make those investments, and these investments can be partly growth of what we've already got. We have got stuff, and it also partly needs to be attract new players in our marketplace, and so I think we've talked about it. It's the platform, people, infrastructure, the business environment, and then the physical infrastructure as well.
Thank you. Oh.
You guys have already said most of it. From my point of view, again, it's this long-term perspective and this multi-technology approach, because we're dealing with the product that goes into consumers' homes. And we've become so reliant upon one fuel vector, one fuel type. We need to take a much more multi-technology and multi-vector approach as we go through the next couple of decades on this transition towards a net zero journey.
Thank you. And to what extent is the UK overly reliant on a single country for products, for components, materials? I mean, I'm thinking of, we look at Xinjiang, for example, 35% of polysilicon comes from Xinjiang with its obvious concerns about forced labour. To what extent is that a really key issue for the UK, sourcing those components? Master?
Maybe start with. So again, I'll go back to that point I made around there is a kind of tight supply chain. there will be kind of challenges to compete for that available supply chain, and how do we then focus on encouraging kind of the onshoring of that supply chain capacity as and when we can is going to be important. But I think in terms of delivery of the projects that we're kind of involved in, we're kind of will be competing in the same space for a number of those components where we may not be able to scale, but where we have been able to kind of secure supply chain capacity. That's come from kind of the real world kind of realities of what does the supply chain kind of contractor want from a company like SSE. They want a long pipeline of projects that they can kind of invest against themselves, rather than are you going to order a couple of turbines for 3 years time, and actually are you going to order any more. It's actually how do you move from ordering 300 or 250 turbines in 3 years time to how are you going to place an order for 100 turbines a year for the next 10 years. That's how you kind of hook in supply chain investment here in the UK.
And to what extent in your sector, for example, is there a capacity to recycle components and product in your supply chains?
I mean, it's going to be a really important part of what we do, but and the kind of the wind industry is doing a lot of work at kind of circular economy to make sure that kind of the turbines that we install are able to be kind of properly recycled. I think maybe Duncan might be a little bit close to that, but it's going to be critical that what we're installing is not only kind of has a circularity built in at the start. Actually, a key point of what we're considering in terms of how we deploy infrastructure is making sure that our impact on the environment and on communities is a kind of positive net benefit to them, that we're not coming in and kind of putting infrastructure in at the sake of communities, but doing it with their consent and kind of sharing the kind of benefits with them.
Right. Same question to you, James, really.
I think you kind of referenced the one area silica where there is a kind of a very narrow market, but actually IRA we are starting to see in America now some solar supply chain developing. So I don't think there's anything specific I draw out apart from what Alice was saying about that investment. I think that the challenge is that where you see that concentration of supply chain is where you see value for money. So solar panels from China are the cheapest available on the market, and that procurement decision comes back to how we value procurement and value for money at the start to make sure that we are broadening that and also giving opportunity for long-term certainty for scale and investment in a large number of equipment, whether it's solar panels, turbines, electrolysers.
Thank you. Duncan, Carl, if there's anything you'd like to add?
I think as an investor and as a buyer, we always want to see a vibrant, competitive, multi-party supply chain that we can tap into. Today we have some areas where there's a bit too much concentration. But the bigger issue is that we've got loads of areas where there just isn't enough capacity. So I think actually we're at a special moment in time when the world's changing and we need a major investment. So I think it's that more than concentration, I would say. And and the circularity just emphasised that. Obviously, a lot of energy assets are very long-term assets. So the phase we're seeing now with exponential growth in some new technologies, it will be in 20 or 30 years' time when we see the growth in volume of the circular element. But for example, in a wind turbine, 85% plus can be of the steel and copper, eminently recyclable and valuable to do so when it comes to it.
Great, thank you. Carl?
Not much to add, really. Sustainability is a really big topic. We're lucky from a supply chain point of view. We're part of a big multinational group. But actually, some of that sustainability starts to question whether we start to onshore some more activity with the precise target of reducing carbon emissions throughout the whole supply chain. So those are some of the areas we're looking at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just a very quick one, really, because I'm going back to skills again, which we talked about earlier on. So I can see this working between big business to big business. I can understand that. But the majority of this kind of work that we do, heating systems and that kind of thing currently, is with small businesses, very often one-man bands and that kind of thing. And we'll need to be able to rely on those people in order to ramp this thing up. So, Carl, I think I've been on one of your seminars about 18 months ago where you were talking about Worcester, Bosch, setting out apprenticeships and training of individual heating suppliers, for example. Is that the kind of thing you could ramp up and scale across the country?
Yeah, and that's what we're planning to do from an electrification of heat point of view. So we've got 5 or 6 training centres around the country. We train 25,000 installers every year on our equipment. So we're well set up. It's been part of our DNA for 20, 30 years. Now we're transitioning that to training them on electrification of heat, on heat pumps. But actually it's getting that timing right because the upskilling they need is more on the electrical side, not necessarily on the heating and the heating system design side. But the timing issue is because most of them have got very little demand at the moment for that type of product, that type of work. So we're training them, and then they don't use those skills for quite some considerable time.
Exactly.
So we're then going round loops of retraining and retraining. Yeah.
Absolutely, chicken and egg, and yet we've still got to get to 2050 with all these people transitioning. So
correct, yeah.
Very, very difficult. What's SSE doing about this?
Sorry, in terms of reskilling
yes.
work. So we do a lot of kind of direct training from apprentices through to kind of graduates into the company. I think actually our investment program to deliver on it is going to need people. We're employing 1,000 people a year to our kind of 12,000 people workforce entirely to deliver on our kind of investment plans going forward. But in terms of making sure that we can kind of contribute to the wider ecosystem, we've kind of put in place a pretty robust just transition strategy. We're the first energy company to do so in 2020. It's about kind of how do you phase people into these kind of new low carbon opportunities, but then also how do you kind of ensure there's a kind of pathway out of the high carbon activities. And actually, in terms of maybe I'll use one example around CCS and hydrogen. Actually, there was a couple of years ago, there was a lot of focus about, what are you going to do with the gas power stations that remain on the system and are there to kind of keep kind of the lights on. Actually, we took a kind of clear decision to say that actually we are kind of, we could move on that asset to private equity quite happily from their perspective, but actually we saw ourselves as the best owner of that asset to be able to transition those important sites for communities around the country. And our power CCS projects and our hydrogen power projects are going to be critical linchpins for the deployment of CCS and hydrogen infrastructure within the UK's industrial clusters. So in terms of skilling and reskilling and ensuring there's a kind of transition plan for kind of people in communities, it's at the heart of what we try to do, and I can share our just transition strategy with the committee in a bit more detail.
Yes, please. Thank you. James Duncan, anything else you'd like to add at all?
No, I think as Equins, we have 600 apprentices across our 15,000 employees, and where we operate, for example, in Birmingham, across the shared the SHDF funding for retrofit of social housing, we use local supply chain wherever possible. So we see it as our role as a strategic supplier to government to invest in skills, not only for our own organisation, but also in the environments in which we work.
Thank you. Duncan?
I suppose I would just say that we're an example of retraining ourselves. We were a high carbon energy company, coal and oil and gas, and we have spent a number of years both converting ourselves to clean and also retraining our workforces. And we're now, of course, developing bespoke apprentice programs, bespoke partnerships with education institutions and other partners. And I think particularly where we find we haven't got the scale in a particular discipline, we're also now starting to twin up with others who are in the same position so that we together build enough scale to do a programme together.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. This has been an extremely useful session. Let me just wrap up by asking you all one question which came up in our earlier panel, which is we had the head of the ABI. She's helping steward a group of investors that are looking after all of our pensions. They're committed to spending about 100 billion, investing 100 billion over the next 10 years. But one of the big problems is just the lack of projects coming through in the project pipeline. Now, you've all highlighted problems around that long-term demand curve, skills, planning, skills. We'll come back to that a lot. But just give us a top line on why those projects are not coming forward at quite the pace that might meet the investment appetite. Alistair, do you want to start?
So, firstly, on electricity transmission, they are. A lot of progress being made in deploying the electricity transmission grid out to 2035. On offshore wind, we've hit a number of road bumps in the sense of we've had a failed auction the parameters for the upcoming auction are unambitious, let's say, maybe. And actually, we don't have a clear plan about what we're going to do for the next few auctions. So we're at AR6 now, but after the election, it'll be AR7, AR8, AR9, which will be the ones that are going to be critical for does the UK meet its 2030 offshore wind target. And on CCS and hydrogen, we've basically had slow progress in kind of support frameworks to actually deploy the infrastructure, which companies like SSE are going to need to connect into.
Useful, thank you, James.
So I think building on that, I think so planning a challenge. So I take Solar to start with. So it's the ability to get projects through, to get consent quickly. I think then also we take hydrogen. It's the alignment of funding with the real world project delivery. So that I alluded to earlier, which is where you're forced to make commitments in terms of cost before you fully understand design in order to get your funding. So I think it's alignment of government intervention with real project delivery and enabling consent to happen quickly.
Yeah, so for that bit of the investment that is in infrastructure that will produce energy, we've got the tools and the frameworks, we've got the contracts, the long-term contracts, we've got allocation rounds, we've got the regulatory ecosystem. So as Alistair says, it's about making it clear and ambitious enough and foreseeable enough to drive that. And then I think most of the rest of our discussion today has been about the other bit, which is in the supply chain side, the industry side that will support that infrastructure. So I think we've covered that.
Certainty. We, compared to my colleagues here, we're at the end of the supply chain, so they supply the stuff to the house, we burn it, we transform it into heat. And there is so much uncertainty about what that future energy system looks like. We just need that medium, long-term certainty so we can all make those investments. And it's been lacking for the last 10 years and it continues to lack now.
So it sounds like from across the board, actually, policy haze is the kind of number one problem that is getting in the way of investable projects. Right, thank you very much indeed. That's been a brilliant session. The committee is very grateful to you for your evidence. Feel free to submit anything further to us as we draw up our conclusions about what the industrial strategy for the UK's transition to net zero should look like. But for now, that concludes this panel and this session. Order, order.